Hey guys, so it turns out I'm not going to be able to be at school on Friday, so here is a hastily recorded video, brief mini lecture about Macbeth Act IV. I know you have your Act IV discussion board, so I really don't want to get into too much detail. I really want you guys to have an idea to share your ideas in that discussion board. But there are a few things that I think we need to discuss first so that you are better prepared for that assignment. First of all, I want to talk about the witch's spell at the beginning of Act 4. All of the things that they're throwing in that cauldron. Someone in one of the other classes called it this really bizarre shopping list. And it is a very bizarre shopping list. Like, where would you even get these things? But notice the first part of what they say, where there's like eye of newt and toe of frog. That whole list of things, those are things that you could actually possibly find, right? You could find a frog and cut off its toe. You could find a newt and take out its eye. Now it's weird, but it's doable, right? But the second portion, that's where things get really strange. Scale of dragon, well, yeah, you're not going to be able to find that. And that's where we get into the even like the really gross stuff, like liver of blaspheming Jew. What is that even about? We should probably take a moment to pause and talk about the fact that Shakespeare is notoriously anti-Semitic. That is something that is rampant in Shakespeare. And in fact, Merchant of Venice is entirely about how this Jewish guy is really greedy and bad. So it's not unusual for the time period, and it's not unusual for Shakespeare. So yeah, that just take the liver of blaspheming Jew with a grain of salt. But in that section too, finger of birth strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drab. I don't know if you recall that word drab in Hamlet means like a prostitute. So ditch delivered, that this prostitute had a baby in a ditch and then strangled it. And then the witches cut off its finger to throw into the cauldron. So this spell that they're mixing up in the cauldron, it's filled with all of these really evil, horrible, violent things. And all of that is what mixes together to create these apparitions, right? I'm sure you did notice the double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, which is pretty classic. You've probably heard that before. That's quoted all the time, right? But look at those words in particular. Double toil and trouble. What does this spell do for Macbeth? It doubles his work, right? He's got to work even harder after this to keep the crown. It also doubles his trouble, doesn't it? Because after this, everything just explodes. Everything just goes totally off the rails, and he's got so many more problems. So it is interesting that double toil and trouble really does come from the fire that's burning in the cauldron that's bubbling. And hopefully you did also notice by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes. Another famous quote, and of course the book and the movie, Something Wicked This Way Comes, coming from this quote. But did you notice how immediately, this is at the beginning of Act 4, Scene 1, right when Macbeth comes in, by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes. Open locks, whoever knocks, enter Macbeth. So what is the something wicked that comes this way? Well, dude, it's Macbeth. He walks in right after they say that. All right, the apparitions. One of the things I want to point out with those apparitions is what they are is actually like what Macbeth is seeing in these apparitions. That's what actually comes to be. What he hears from the apparitions is really more what he wants to hear than what actually is. So, for example, the very first one, the armed head, right, that warns him about Macduff. It's, a head not with arms, but like with armor on, right? So a head that's got like a helmet on, and it says to beware of Macduff. Well, think about when he meets up with Macduff later. What's the context? What's Macduff wearing? The armor, the battle, right? And of course, at that moment, he does need to beware of Macduff. But it's interesting how this tells him beware of Macduff, and notice his reaction. He's like, well, yeah, I kind of suspected that already. I already knew that. And that lulls him into this trust of the subsequent apparitions. The second apparition is the bloody child. And the bloody child tells him that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. Now think about the concept of the bloody child. When we're talking about and as we, find out later with Macduff, a child that is untimely ripped from his mother's womb, that child would be bloody, right? So he sees this bloody child. So there is a way that this could happen, but he hears none of woman born shall harm Macbeth, and he's lulled into this false sense of security, because how could that be? Everyone's born of woman. Now, for us today, this idea of C-section is something that is more usual, right? It's not unfamiliar, but at this time, that's not something that usually happens, right? If you have a C-section, mom dies. End of story. So it's not really this idea of being born so much as it is almost like being, I don't know, it sounds horrible to say it, but like harvested, right? Because the mother doesn't live. So there's not this idea of being born. So it is kind of a technicality there. The third apparition is this crown child holding a tree. And this is the one that says, you don't have anything to fear until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane. So remember at the end, how does Birnam Wood come? They're holding trees. So the apparition is holding a tree, but Macbeth doesn't see that. He just hears what he wants to hear, that you have nothing to fear till the woods come. And of course, how are trees going to walk, right? So he doesn't question that. But it's right there in front of his face. And then the line of kings, of course, the fourth apparition, the line of kings that look like Banquo, and that speaks to Macbeth's fear. But what's interesting is that the answer is right in front of his face, but he doesn't see it. He refuses to see what's there. Instead, he hears what he wants to hear. And I think that's particularly frightening, because isn't that what we tend to do as human beings? Like, we tend to hear what we want to hear instead of seeing the facts that are right in front of us. Of course, this is what leads him to slaughter Macduff's family. Like, oh my goodness, why? That's so violent. Why does he need to do this? I don't want to say too much about it, because one of the discussion questions kind of circles around that. So I don't want to say too much, but I do want to share with you the way that I saw this portrayed. Like 12 years ago, I saw a production of this at Campus Theater. And dude, they had this table, because it's not just one child, right? Macduff's, there's one child who speaks in the scene, but later when Macduff finds out, later in the act, he says, all my children. So he uses that plural, indicating that it's more than just one child who dies. It's not just the one who stands up and they say, what, you egg, and stabs him. There's more than just that child. So the way I saw this production done, they had like this big table and like probably like 6 or 7 kids around it, like a bunch of kids. And some of them were just little, like 3 or 4 years old. And when the murderers came in, the strobe light came on, and all these kids just start falling to the ground as the murderers are stabbing him. Lady Macduff was nursing a baby in this production, and they ripped I'm assuming it was a doll. They ripped it out of her hands, threw it down on the stage, and stomped on it. It was so brutal. It was so violent. And this scene, this is so brutal. And it's one of the most brutal scenes I've ever experienced in drama, like in a play, in watching a play. So this kind of brutality is typical of Macbeth. And I think that that's kind of what Malcolm touches on in the next scene, because I want to also talk about Malcolm's test of Macduff, right? Where he says that he's all these things that he's really not. First, he says that he is lustful, right? That he wants all the women in the world and he can never get enough. And Macduff is like, well, we got plenty of women in Scotland. Okay. And then he goes on to tell Macduff that Malcolm is so greedy. He wants all the money. And again, Macduff's like, well, that's not great, but we have plenty of money, so okay. But notice what makes Macduff finally say, enough. No, I can't stand up for you, Malcolm. It's when Malcolm says that it's not just these things, but he also is so violent that he just does not ever want to keep the peace. He will do everything he can to just keep constant war going. And at that point, Macduff backs off. He's like, I can't deal with that. That's not okay. Poor Scotland. There is no one who can be king. Because Macbeth has installed all this brutality into Scotland. And so if Malcolm's just going to do the same thing, well, then why do they need to dethrone Macbeth? It's just replacing Macbeth with someone just like him. So there's no purpose to it. So I think that's kind of interesting that that's Macduff's breaking point, is that brutality and that violence. So some bad qualities in a king are okay, but this one is absolutely not. And it speaks to what Scotland's facing also politically. I do also want to mention Ross, because Ross is such a weird character. Ross equivocates here with Macduff, right? Because Macduff says, hey, how is my family? And Ross says, oh, they were fine when I left them, which isn't a lie. When Ross left them in the previous scene, they were fine. They were still alive. But of course, Ross knows that shortly after he left them, they all died. And of course, he circles around and finally does tell Macduff. But it's interesting, that equivocation at the beginning. Why doesn't he just tell Macduff right away? Notice how the scene unfolds and how Macduff pledges his support sort of first. And then Ross kind of tells him this terrible news, and it just kind of solidifies the deal. So it's interesting that Ross is almost manipulating Macduff's allegiance here by not revealing the information immediately. Now, I think there are other ways we could look at that too, but that's just something kind of to ponder. All right, so that's a few things to ponder about Act 4. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am, and I wish that I could be there. All of that being said, next week, if you are in person, please make sure that you have a device in class and maybe some headphones so that you can log into Zoom next week. All right, because we'll be logging into Zoom and everything will be taught over Zoom until February 1st. I am available via email, so email me any questions that you have. You got your Act 4 discussion board assignment, so go ahead and work on that, and I will see you on Zoom on Monday. Have a great weekend.